Close your eyes, take a slow breath in, and let it go. Let your body sink a little deeper into the place where you are resting. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Nothing else you need to do, just this voice, and the slow unfolding of a story that happened a very long time ago, in a part of the world where the light falls golden across dust and stone, where empires rose out of the quiet plains and rivers of a land the old world called Persia. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are listening, let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is as you join us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum tonight's journey together. Somewhere in the south of what is now Iran, more than 26 centuries ago, there was a small kingdom called Anshan. It was not grand, it was not famous, it was a modest cluster of settlements tucked among hills and dry riverbeds, ruled by a family that for a time answered to a larger power. The people who lived there raised sheep and goats. They grew barley in narrow terraces. They spoke a language we now call Old Persian, a tongue that would one day be carved into the sides of mountains, but which then was simply the language of shepherds, and farmers murmured in the evenings over small fires. It is easy to forget, when we speak of empires, that they all begin this small, a handful of families, a cluster of mud brick homes, a river that floods some years and fails in others. The land does not announce that it will one day be the center of the known world. It simply exists, patient, indifferent, waiting to see what the people living on it will do. The man who would change everything for this quiet corner of the world was born, as far as we can tell, sometime around the year 600 before our era. His name has come down to us as Cyrus. Later ages would call him Cyrus the Great, though of course no child is born great. Greatness, if it comes at all, is built slowly, decision by decision, across a lifetime, the way a river carves a canyon, not in a single flood, but in 10,000 quiet years of patient water. Let your shoulders relax as you listen. There is no test at the end of this. Only the pleasure of drifting through history, the way a boat drifts down a slow, wide river. Cyrus inherited a kingdom that was, in the larger scheme of the ancient Near East, a minor vassal state. To the west lay Media, a larger and more powerful kingdom that ruled over Anshan and much of the Iranian plateau. To the west of Media lay Babylon, ancient and wealthy, sitting on the fertile plain between two rivers, a city so old that even in Cyrus's time it seemed to have always existed. Further west still lay Lydia, fabulously rich in gold, and beyond that, across the sea, the Greek cities were only beginning to build the civilization that would one day write so much of what we know about this era. Cyrus did not set out at first to conquer the world. He set out, it seems, simply to stop being someone else's subject. Around 550 before our era, he led a revolt against his Median overlord, a king named Astyages. The old stories, some of them more legend than history, say that Astyages had once dreamed that his daughter's child would overthrow him, and so he had ordered the infant Cyrus killed at birth, only for a shepherd to save the child and raise him in secret. We cannot know how much of this is true, and how much is the kind of story that grows up around great men after they are gone, the way moss grows on the north side of an old stone wall. What we do know is that Cyrus rose against Media, and won, and where there might have been a bloodbath of vengeance, there was instead something unusual for the ancient world. He kept the Median nobility largely in place. He married into their royal line. He did not raise their cities. This pattern, appearing so early in his career, is worth resting on for a moment. The way you might rest your eyes on a single still point in a slowly turning room. Cyrus seemed to understand something that many conquerors before him did not. That an empire built purely on terror is an empire that must be held together by force forever, at enormous cost. But an empire that offers its conquered peoples something to gain by cooperating quietly holds itself together. With Media absorbed rather than destroyed, Cyrus turned his attention outward. Lydia, in the west, ruled by the fabulously wealthy King Croesus, watched the rise of this new Persian power with unease. Croesus is remembered in later Greek writing for his gold, for the saying "rich as Croesus," which still exists in English today, all these thousands of years later, though most who use the phrase no longer know where it began. Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether he should go to war with the Persians, and the oracle told him that if he did, a great empire would fall. Croesus, delighted, marched to war, certain the great empire that would fall was Persia. It was, in the end, his own. The Lydian capital of Sardis fell to Cyrus around 546 before our era, and with it all the Greek cities of Ionia, on the coast of what is now western Turkey, came under Persian rule as well, cities that had been Greek in culture and language for centuries, now finding themselves subjects of a Persian king. This moment, quiet as it seems in the retelling, planted a seed that would not fully bloom into conflict for another 2 generations, but bloom it eventually would, in wars that Greek writers would remember as the defining struggle of their age. Let the weight of your eyelids grow heavier now. There is nothing urgent in this story. It has already happened. It cannot be changed by anything you do tonight. You are only visiting it, the way you might visit an old house that is no longer lived in, walking slowly from room to room by lamplight. If you are enjoying what we do here, take just a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it costs you nothing at all. And then you can close your eyes again and keep drifting with us through the centuries. After Lydia, Cyrus turned east and consolidated Persian control over much of the Iranian plateau, over lands that stretched toward what is now Afghanistan and the edges of Central Asia. But the greatest prize of all still lay ahead of him, gleaming on the banks of the Euphrates: Babylon. Babylon in the 6th century before our era was, without exaggeration, one of the wealthiest and most magnificent cities that had ever existed on the earth. Its walls were said to be so thick that a chariot could turn around upon them. Its great temple to the god Marduk rose in tiers above the flat plain like an artificial mountain. Its gardens, whether or not they truly hung in the way later legend imagined, were spoken of with awe throughout the ancient world. It was a city of canals and processional streets, of glazed blue brick gates decorated with golden bulls and dragons, of scholars who charted the movements of the stars with a precision that would not be matched again for a very long time. And yet, by the time Cyrus turned his gaze toward it, Babylon was ruled by a king named Nabonidus, who had become deeply unpopular with his own priesthood and people, in part because of his devotion to a moon god over Marduk, the traditional chief deity of the city. When Cyrus's armies approached in 539 before our era, the accounts that survive, including a remarkable clay artifact known today as the Cyrus cylinder, suggest that Babylon fell with remarkably little resistance, its gates open to the Persian king, almost as if the city itself was relieved to welcome him. The Cyrus cylinder deserves a moment of quiet attention, resting here in the dark with you, because it tells us something extraordinary about how Cyrus chose to present himself, and perhaps about how he actually ruled. On this cylinder, written in the cuneiform script of ancient Babylon, Cyrus describes himself not as a foreign conqueror crushing a defeated people, but as a king restored. A king who returned the images of the gods to their rightful temples, who allowed captive peoples to return to their homelands, who ended the burdens that had been placed on the common people of the city. Among those who are said to have benefited from this policy were the Judean exiles, the people of Jerusalem who had been taken to Babylon decades earlier, after the destruction of their first temple. The Hebrew Bible remembers Cyrus by name, calling him a shepherd of the divine will, a king who permitted the exiles to return home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. It is a striking thing, if you think about it slowly here in the dark, that a Persian king from a small kingdom in the Iranian hills became remembered centuries later in the sacred texts of a people whose homeland lay 1,000 miles to the west. Ret with that thought a moment. An empire is not only armies and gold. Sometimes it is remembered, across thousands of years, for a single act of mercy. Cyrus ruled for a handful more years after the fall of Babylon, expanding Persian territory further east, before he died, according to most accounts, in battle against a nomadic people known as the Massagetae, somewhere on the eastern frontier of his empire, around 530 before our era. His tomb still stands today, or at least a tomb attributed to him does, a simple stone structure at a place called Pasargadae. In modern Iran, a modest gabled building raised on a stepped platform, far less grand than the tombs of many lesser kings who came after him. There is something fitting in that simplicity. The man who built an empire out of a shepherd kingdom chose, or was given, a resting place of quiet, unadorned stone. Let yourself drift now, deeper, into the world Cyrus left behind him. An empire that stretched, by the time of his death, from the Aegean coast of Anatolia in the west to the edges of India in the east, larger than any political entity that had existed before it in human history. And yet this empire was only beginning. His son Cambyses ruled next, and under Cambyses the Persian Empire absorbed Egypt, ancient even then. Its pyramids already 2,000 years old by the time Persian soldiers marched along the Nile. Cambyses' reign was shorter and more troubled than his father's, and the ancient sources, many of them written centuries later by Greek historians who did not always view Persia kindly, describe him in ways that may or may not be entirely fair. What matters for the slow unspooling of this story is that after his death, in a period of confusion and disputed succession, a new figure rose to take the Persian throne. His name was Darius. Darius was not, as far as we know, a direct descendant of Cyrus, though he claimed kinship with the royal line. He came to power around 522 before our era amid civil war and rebellion across the empire, and it is a testament to his skill as both a soldier and an administrator that within a few years he had not only secured the throne, but had begun to build something that Cyrus, the great conqueror, had never quite had time to finish. A system, under Darius, the sprawling patchwork of conquered peoples and kingdoms that made up the Persian Empire was organized into provinces called satrapies, each governed by an official called a satrap, who answered to the king, but held considerable local authority. This was, in its way, one of the great administrative inventions of the ancient world, a method for governing an empire so vast that no single ruler could personally oversee every corner of it. Darius also standardized weights, measures, and currency across the empire, introducing gold and silver coins that carried his image, a bow drawn in the hand of a kneeling archer, coins that would circulate from Greece to India. He built roads too, and this is perhaps the achievement for which Darius is best remembered by later ages. The royal road, stretching some 1,500 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa, one of the Persian capitals, in the east, was maintained by relay stations where messengers on horseback could exchange tired horses for fresh ones, carrying royal messages across the entire breadth of the empire in a matter of days rather than months. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing perhaps a century later, described these messengers with an admiration that has echoed down through the ages in a saying that has attached itself, much later, to an entirely different postal service on an entirely different continent. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Herodotus never wrote those exact words, of course. Later writers reshaped his description into that famous phrasing. But the admiration for the Persian courier system was genuine, and it has outlived the empire that built it by 2,500 years. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of this story. There is a soft rhythm to history when you let it unfold this way. One king following another, one road, stretching toward one horizon after another, the whole vast machine of empire turning slowly, slowly. like a great wheel in the dark. Darius also began construction of a city that would become the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a place called Parsa, which we know today by its Greek name Persepolis. Built into the base of a mountain in the region of Fars, in what is now southern Iran, Persepolis was not strictly speaking a capital in the sense of a seat of everyday government. The Persian kings and their courts moved between several cities depending on the season, spending winters in the warmer climate of Susa, summers in the cooler mountain air of Ecbatana, the old Median capital. Persepolis was something else, a stage, a place built for ceremony for the great spring festival when representatives from every corner of the empire, from Ethiopia to India, from Scythia to Egypt, would travel to bring tribute and pay homage to the King of Kings. Picture it now if you can, in the soft darkness behind your closed eyes. A vast terraced platform rising from the plain, built of massive stone blocks fitted together so precisely that even today, weathered by 25 centuries, the joints between them are barely visible. Grand staircases wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, carved along their length with processions of tribute bearers in relief, each figure carrying gifts from his homeland, a Median noble leading a fine horse, a Bactrian bringing a camel, an Ethiopian carrying ivory tusks, an Indian bringing gold dust in woven baskets, massive columns, some rising 60 feet into the air, topped with the carved forms of twin bulls or twin griffins, their stone bodies once so smooth and finely worked that ancient visitors described the columns as seeming almost to breathe. The Apadana, the great audience hall of Persepolis, could hold thousands of people, its ceiling supported by dozens of towering columns, its walls once painted in vivid colours that have long since faded, leaving only the pale stone we see in photographs today. Though we should remember that in its own time, this place was not the muted grey ruin so many now imagine. It was riotous with colour. Blue and red and gold, bright banners, polished bronze. The soft golden Persian sunlight, falling across painted stone reliefs of lions and bulls locked in eternal combat. Symbols perhaps of the turning of the seasons, of light triumphing over darkness. Themes that ran deep through Persian religious thought, because we should pause here, in this slow unwinding of empire, and speak a moment of what these people believed in the quiet hours before sleep, about the nature of the universe itself. The Persians, or at least many of them, followed a faith associated with a teacher and prophet named Zoroaster, whose exact dates are lost somewhere in the fog of the ancient past, some placing him many centuries before Cyrus, others closer to his time. Zoroastrian belief, as it developed, imagined the cosmos as a great struggle between a principle of truth and light, called Ahura Mazda, and a principle of falsehood and darkness. Fire held a sacred place in this faith, not worshipped as a god itself, but honoured as a symbol of divine truth and purity, and fire altars, their flames tended endlessly by priests, burned in temples across the Persian world. There is something worth resting on, here in the dark, in the fact that this faith imagined a universe locked in moral struggle, where truth mattered, where a person's thoughts and words and deeds were weighed against a standard of righteousness. Whether or not Darius or Cyrus were strict Zoroastrians in the way later tradition imagined, the language of truth against the lie runs through Darius's own inscriptions, carved high on a cliff face at a place called Behistun, where he described his rise to power and named the enemies he claimed to have been, lies rebelling against the truth embodied in his rule. It is one of the oldest surviving political manifestos in human history. Carved in 3 languages into solid rock, a king justifying himself to eternity. Let your mind rest now on the ordinary people of this empire, not only the kings and the carved monuments, but the millions of quiet lives that filled the spaces between the great events. A farmer in the Mesopotamian plain, rising before dawn to check the level of the irrigation canal that fed his barley field, worrying, as farmers always worry, about rain and drought, and the health of his animals. a weaver in one of the Persian cities, working brightly dyed wool into patterns that would one day be echoed, faintly, in the carpets that still bear the name Persian today, 25 centuries later, in homes half a world away. A scribe in Susa trained for years to write in the elegant wedge-shaped cuneiform script, keeping careful records of grain deliveries and tax payments on small clay tablets that have survived, by pure accident of fire and burial, into our own time, giving us glimpses of ordinary administrative life that no king's inscription would ever have thought to preserve. Life for these people was not, of course, uniformly comfortable. The empire demanded tribute, and tribute meant taxation, and taxation always falls heaviest on those with the least to spare. There were, without question, enslaved people within the Persian world, as there were in every ancient civilization, though the specific character of servitude in the Achaemenid Empire seems, from what evidence survives, to have differed in some ways from later, more brutal systems, with many labourers receiving rations and even wages for their work, a detail that should not be romanticised, but is worth noting honestly, here in the quiet dark, as we try to see this world clearly, rather than through the golden haze of legend. Religious tolerance, too, seems to have been a genuine and consistent Persian policy, not merely a matter of Cyrus's famous cylinder. Subject peoples were, by and large, permitted to worship their own gods, follow their own customs, and govern many of their own local affairs, so long as tribute was paid and rebellion was avoided. This was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkably pragmatic and often humane approach to ruling a vast and diverse population, one that stands in real contrast to some later empires that would attempt to erase local identity entirely. Breathe slowly here. Let the centuries pass over you like slow-moving clouds. It was under Darius that Persia first came into serious conflict with the Greek world, a conflict that would occupy the attention of later ages far more than almost anything else about the Persian Empire, largely because it was the Greeks, not the Persians, who wrote the histories that survived in the greatest detail into modern times. In 499 before our era, the Greek cities of Ionia, still resentful of Persian rule since the days of Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, rose in revolt, aided for a time by soldiers from Athens itself, a city on the Greek mainland that had sent ships to help its distant Ionian cousins. The revolt was eventually crushed, but Darius, we are told, never forgot that Athens had dared to send help to his rebellious subjects. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Darius kept a servant whose sole task was to say to him, each evening at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians," so that his anger would never cool into forgetfulness. Whether this detail is entirely true, or a flourish added by later storytellers, it captures something real about the slow-burning nature of the conflict that followed. In 490 before our era, Darius sent an expedition across the Aegean to punish Athens directly. The Persian force landed on a plain near a small town called Marathon, and there met a Greek army, badly outnumbered, that nonetheless won a stunning victory, driving the Persians back to their ships. It was, in the long history of the Persian Empire, a minor setback, a single failed punitive raid against one troublesome city among 100 under Persian rule. But for the Greeks, and for the entire later Western historical tradition that would grow from Greek writing, Marathon became something else entirely. A symbol, the moment when a free people fighting for their own soil defeated the armies of the greatest empire on earth. The word marathon itself, of course, comes down to us today attached to a race of just over 26 miles, commemorating, according to a legend that grew up centuries later, a runner named Pheidippides, who supposedly ran from the battlefield to Athens to announce the victory before collapsing and dying from the effort. Historians are not at all certain this run actually happened as described, but the story has outlived the certainty, the way the best stories always do. Darius died a few years later, before he could avenge this defeat, and the task fell to his son, a young man named Xerxes, whose name has come down through history perhaps more dramatically, more theatrically than any other Persian king. Thanks in large part to the Greek playwrights and historians who wrote about him, and thanks, in our own time, to the way popular culture has continued to reimagine and often exaggerate his story. Xerxes inherited an empire even larger than the one his father had ruled, and in 480 before our era, he launched what may have been the largest military expedition the ancient world had yet seen, an invasion of Greece involving, according to Herodotus's admittedly inflated numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and a vast supporting fleet. Modern historians generally believe the true numbers were considerably smaller, though still enormous for the era, likely in the range of 100 to 300,000 men, a staggering logistical achievement simply to feed and water, regardless of the fighting itself. The invasion is remembered today above all for a single battle, fought at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, where a small force of Greek soldiers, most famously 300 Spartans led by their king Leonidas, held the pass for 3 days against the entire Persian army, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defense before being surrounded and annihilated to the last man. After a local resident showed the Persians a hidden path around the Greek position, it is a story of doomed heroism that has echoed down through 25 centuries, retold in poems and plays and in our own era, in films and graphic novels, though these modern retellings, it must be said gently, often lean far more into dramatic legend than into careful history, and they rarely pause to consider the story from the Persian side at all, rarely imagine the ordinary Persian soldiers, conscripted from Bactria or Egypt or Babylon, who also died in that narrow pass, far from their own homes, fighting a war they had not chosen and would never fully understand the meaning of. Let that thought settle gently in the dark. Every battle in history has at least 2 sides, and only one of them usually gets to write the story afterward. Despite the Persian victory at Thermopylae, and despite Xerxes' forces going on to burn Athens itself, the invasion ultimately failed. The Persian fleet was defeated at the naval battle of Salamis, in the narrow straits near Athens, and the following year the remaining Persian land forces were defeated at Plataea. Xerxes returned home, and while Persian forces would continue to contest control of the Aegean and the Greek cities of Ionia for decades afterward, the great invasion of mainland Greece was over and had failed. It is worth pausing, here in the soft dark, to place this failure in its proper proportion. For the Greeks, the defeat of Xerxes' invasion became, and remains to this day, one of the founding stories of Western civilization, the moment when democracy, however imperfect and limited it truly was in ancient Athens, supposedly triumphed over Eastern despotism. But for the Persian Empire itself, vast and wealthy and stretching across 3 continents, the failed Greek campaign was a costly but ultimately survivable setback. A single failed frontier war at the very edge of an empire whose center of gravity lay far to the east, in Persia proper, in Babylon, in Egypt, in lands where Persian rule would continue largely unshaken for another century and a half. Xerxes himself was assassinated in a palace conspiracy in 465 before our era, and the empire continued under a succession of later kings, Artaxerxes, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, each ruling over an empire that remained, for generations, the wealthiest and most powerful political entity in the known world, even as its energy for further expansion gradually cooled, even as court intrigue and occasional succession disputes weakened the throne from within. Rest now, and let the story move forward across these quieter centuries, when less dramatic events but no less real human lives filled the vast spaces of the empire. Persian administrators continued to govern using the system Darius had built. Merchants carried goods along the royal road and across the Persian Gulf, connecting India to Egypt to Greece in networks of trade that would not be fully replicated again until the era of the Silk Road centuries later. Persian gardens, formal and geometric, divided by channels of water into 4 quarters, gave the world a word and a concept paradise, which comes to us through Greek and then through Latin, from an old Persian word for a walled garden or park. Think of that as you drift towards sleep. The very word we use for heaven itself began as the name for a Persian king's private garden. Persian art and craftsmanship flourished during these centuries too. Gold and silver work of extraordinary delicacy, drinking vessels shaped like the heads of lions and rams, jewelry inlaid with turquoise and lapis lazuli brought along trade routes from as far away as what is now Afghanistan. Persian textiles, dyed in rich purples and reds, were prized luxuries as far away as Greece and Egypt. And Persian cuisine, too, left its mark, with the royal kitchen said to serve dishes drawing on ingredients gathered from every province of the empire. A table that was itself a kind of edible map of Persian power. But no empire endures forever, and by the middle of the 4th century before our era, a new power was rising in the north, in a kingdom the Persians had for a long time paid little serious attention to, Macedonia. In 336 before our era, a young man became king of Macedonia after his father was assassinated. His name was Alexander, and within a few short years he would accomplish something that no one, least of all the Persian court, believed possible. He would conquer the entire Persian Empire. Let your breathing stay slow, and even as we come to this final great turning in the story. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 before our era with an army far smaller than the forces Persia could theoretically muster, some 40,000 men against an empire that could, in principle, have called upon many times that number, but his army was superbly trained, hardened by years of Macedonian campaigns under his father Philip, equipped with a long thrusting pike called the sarissa that gave Macedonian infantry a reach no other army in the ancient world could match, and led with a tactical brilliance and a personal recklessness in battle that has rarely been equalled in the history of warfare. His first major encounter with Persian forces came at the river Granicus in the spring of that same year, where local satraps had gathered an army to stop him at the water's edge rather than allow him to penetrate further into Persian Anatolia. Alexander, against the advice of his own more cautious officers, ordered an immediate cavalry charge across the river itself, into the teeth of the waiting Persian line, leading the charge personally at the head of his companion cavalry, so recklessly exposed to danger that he was very nearly killed in the melee, saved, according to the ancient accounts, only by the timely intervention of one of his own officers who cut down a Persian nobleman about to deliver a fatal blow from behind. The battle was won, the satraps of Anatolia scattered or killed, and the coastal cities of Ionia, still remembering perhaps their own long history of resentment toward Persian rule since the days of Cyrus, opened their gates to Alexander with little resistance. The following year, in 333 before our era, Alexander met a far larger Persian force at Issus, in the mountainous coastal region of what is now southern Turkey, commanded this time not by a regional satrap, but by the Persian king himself, Darius III, a distant descendant of the royal line who had come to the throne only a few years earlier amid considerable court intrigue. The narrow terrain at Issus, hemmed in between mountains and sea, worked against the Persian numerical advantage, much as it had once worked against Xerxes' own army at Thermopylae, a strange historical echo, and Alexander's disciplined phalanx and cavalry broke the Persian line. Darius III, watching his own forces collapse around his position, fled the field, abandoning, in his haste, his own mother, wife, and children to fall into Alexander's hands, a moment of humiliation for the Persian crown that ancient writers, both Greek and later Roman, dwelt on at considerable length, and one that Alexander, to his credit according to most surviving accounts, treated the captured royal women with notable courtesy and respect rather than cruelty, a gesture that may have been genuine chivalry, calculated political theatre, or, most likely, some blend of both. The final decisive battle came in 331 before our era, near a place called Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, where Alexander, still badly outnumbered, once again shattered the Persian army through superior tactics and the sheer momentum of his cavalry charged directly at Darius's position. Darius fled once more, and was murdered soon after by his own officers, a grim and undignified end for the last king of the line that Cyrus had begun 2 centuries before. Alexander went on to burn Persepolis itself, the great ceremonial city Darius the Great had built, reportedly in a fit of drunken revelry, or perhaps, as some ancient sources suggest, as a deliberate symbolic act of vengeance for Xerxes' earlier burning of Athens. A strange and sorrowful echo across a century and a half of history, one great capital burned in payment for another, the blackened ruins of Persepolis, its fallen columns and fire-scarred stone, still stand today in southern Iran, a monument now not to Persian glory alone, but to the fragility of even the grandest human achievements, a lesson that history seems to teach again and again, gently, patiently, to anyone willing to listen in the quiet dark. And yet here is something worth holding on to as we drift now toward the close of this long story. Empires fall, but they are rarely, truly erased. Alexander himself, upon conquering Persia, did not attempt to destroy Persian culture. He adopted Persian dress on formal occasions, married a Bactrian noblewoman named Roxana, and later a Persian princess as well, encouraged his officers to marry Persian wives in a mass ceremony at Susa, and attempted, in his own way, to fuse Greek and Persian civilization into something new. His empire fractured quickly after his early death in 323 before our era, divided among his rival generals into several successor kingdoms, with much of the old Persian heartland falling under a Greek dynasty known as the Seleucids, who ruled for generations as a kind of foreign layer settled atop the deeper, older Persian and Mesopotamian populations beneath them. But the deeper currents of Persian culture and identity did not vanish beneath this Greek veneer, and by the middle of the 3rd century before our era, a new power began rising once again from the Iranian plateau, much as Cyrus's small kingdom had risen from the same hills 8 centuries before. A people called the Parthians, from the northeastern edge of the old Persian world, gradually threw off Seleucid Greek rule and built an empire of their own, one that would eventually stretch across much of the same territory the Achaemenids had once governed, and that would grow strong enough, in time, to fight Rome itself to a standstill along the eastern frontier of the Roman world, a rivalry that would last for centuries, marked by famous Parthian victories, such as the destruction of a Roman army under the general Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 before our era, a defeat the Romans remembered with real bitterness for generations afterward. The Parthians, in turn, gave way, in the early 3rd century of our own era, to a new Persian dynasty called the Sassanids, who consciously and deliberately looked back to the Achaemenid past for inspiration and legitimacy, carving their own royal inscriptions and monuments near the ancient tombs of the old Achaemenid kings, reviving Zoroastrianism as a formal state religion with organized clergy and codified scripture, and building an empire that would rival, and at times genuinely threaten, the later Roman and then Byzantine world for the next 4 centuries, a Persian empire every bit as vast and sophisticated, in its own era as the one Cyrus and Darius had built so long before. It was the Sassanid Persian Empire that the armies of early Islam encountered and eventually conquered in the 7th century of our own era, a conquest that transformed the religious landscape of Iran forever, bringing Islam to a land that had been Zoroastrian for more than 1,000 years. And yet even here, even through this profound transformation, something distinctly Persian endured and adapted rather than disappearing entirely. The Persian language survived and evolved, absorbing new vocabulary, while retaining its own deep grammatical structure, becoming, within a few centuries, one of the great literary languages of the Islamic world, the language of poets like Ferdowsi, who in the 10th and 11th centuries of our era composed an enormous epic poem called the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, retelling, in verse of extraordinary beauty, the legendary and semi-historical history of Persian kingship stretching back, in poetic memory if not always in precise historical fact, toward those same ancient origins we have been walking through together tonight. And Persian artistic and administrative traditions, too, echoed forward into the courts of later Islamic empires, across a vast stretch of the world, into the Abbasid Caliphate, into the later Ottoman and Mughal empires, whose art, whose gardens, whose very concept of paradise as a walled and watered enclosure, all carried within them, whether their builders always recognized it or not, distant inherited echoes of those first Persian paradisa gardens planted so many centuries before. And now, tonight, in the year of our own calendar we currently inhabit, the modern nation of Iran still looks back, across 25 centuries, to this same story we have been telling. Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae still stands, still visited by travellers and by Iranians themselves, who come to pay quiet respect to a figure remembered. Still, as a founder, a symbol of just and tolerant rule, invoked across the political spectrum in modern Iran for many different purposes, but rarely forgotten. Persepolis, its columns broken and its painted colours long since faded to bare stone, remains one of the most visited archaeological sites in the entire region, a UNESCO World Heritage Site drawing visitors from across the globe to stand where Persian kings once received tribute from the ends of the known world, and each spring, on the same turning of the seasons that the ancient Zoroastrians once marked with fire and renewal, Iranians and Persian-speaking communities across the entire world, in Tehran and in Los Angeles, in London and in Dushanbe, still celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, a festival of cleaning and renewal and gathering with family that traces its roots back, through every intervening century, toward those same ancient rhythms of light overcoming darkness that Zoroaster's followers once tended so carefully in their sacred fires so long ago. Let us go back now gently, and linger longer in the middle of this story, in the long, unhurried centuries between the founding and the fall, because it is here, in the ordinary turning of ordinary days, that an empire truly lives. Picture a village in the province the Persians called Babarush, the rich alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a few decades after Cyrus's quiet conquest of Babylon. The sun rises slowly here, the way it always has, spreading first as a thin grey line along the eastern horizon, then warming by degrees into gold, then by mid-morning, into the flat white heat that presses down on the mud-brick rooftops and the dusty paths between them. A farmer, let us imagine, rises before the sun to check the sluice gate that controls the flow of water from the canal into his barley field. This work never changes, empire or no empire. Water must be managed. Silt must be cleared. The gate must be opened at just the right hour, and closed again before the field floods too deeply and drowns the young shoots rather than nourishing them. He pays his taxes now not to a Babylonian official answering to a Babylonian king, but to a Persian-appointed administrator, perhaps a man who himself reports upward through a chain of officials to the satrap of Babylonia, who in turn answers only to the King of Kings himself, far away in Susa or Persepolis, or wherever the royal court currently resides that season. For a farmer like this, the change matters less than you might expect. The tax collector still comes at harvest. The scribe still records the yield on a small tablet of wet clay, pressing a reed stylus into the soft surface in quick practiced wedge-shaped strokes, before setting it in the sun to dry and harden into a permanent record. The language of the tablet may now include Persian terms mixed among the old Babylonian phrases, the way any bureaucracy slowly absorbs the vocabulary of whoever sits at the top of it. But the rhythm of daily life, planting and tending and harvesting, celebrating festivals tied to the turning of the agricultural year, worshipping the old gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon alongside, or perhaps blended quietly with, newer ideas drifting in from Persia, remains largely unchanged. This was, in fact, one of the deep secrets of Persian imperial success, one worth resting on slowly here in the dark. The empire did not attempt to make a Babylonian farmer, or an Egyptian priest, or a Lydian goldsmith into a Persian in language or custom or belief. It simply asked for tribute, for loyalty, for the absence of rebellion, and in exchange it offered something remarkably valuable for the ancient world: relative peace, protected trade routes, and freedom to continue living as one always had. Historians have sometimes called this the Persian peace, echoing a much later phrase used for the long stability of the Roman world. And while the comparison is imperfect, there is truth in it. For long stretches of the 5th and early 4th centuries before our era, a merchant could travel, under Persian protection, from the coast of the Aegean Sea all the way to the valley of the Indus River, passing through a dozen different peoples and languages and religious traditions, and never leave the borders of a single political authority. This had simply never been possible before in human history. Not at this scale. Let your thoughts drift now toward the structure that made this possible, the system of satrapies that Darius built so carefully in the years after he secured his throne. The empire was divided, eventually, into roughly 20 provinces, though the exact number shifted somewhat across different reigns. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap, a word that comes from an old Persian term meaning protector of the kingdom, and each satrap held within his own province a remarkable degree of local authority, collecting taxes, maintaining order, raising local levies of soldiers when the king required them, and often presiding over a small court of his own that mirrored, in miniature, the grandeur of the royal court itself. But Darius, wise in the ways that power tends to corrupt even the most loyal officials when left unchecked for too long, built in careful safeguards against any single satrap growing too independent. Alongside each satrap, in many provinces, there also served a royal secretary, appointed directly by the king rather than by the satrap, whose task was to report independently back to the royal court on the satrap's conduct. A kind of built-in check that meant no governor could easily hide wrongdoing or build a private power base without word eventually reaching the king's own ears. And beyond this, the king maintained a corps of inspectors, sometimes called, by later Greek writers, the eyes and ears of the king, who travelled the empire ostensibly on other business, but always watching, always listening, always ready to report back anything of concern. Consider, too, the sheer diversity that this system had to accommodate. In Egypt, the satrap governed a land with 4,000 years of its own religious tradition already behind it by the time Cambyses arrived, a land where the pharaoh, whoever he was, however foreign his origins, was expected to perform certain sacred duties toward the Egyptian gods in order to maintain cosmic order, what the Egyptians called Mat. Cambyses and later Persian kings, whatever their private beliefs, largely accommodated this, allowing themselves to be depicted in Egyptian temple reliefs performing the traditional pharaonic rituals, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, making offerings to Egyptian gods in the old accustomed forms, even as they remained, in their hearts and their court and their own inscriptions elsewhere in the empire. Entirely Persian, in Lydia the satrap governed a land already famous, even before Persian conquest, for its innovation in coinage, and Sardis, the old Lydian capital, remained under Persian rule, one of the great commercial cities of the ancient world, its markets filled with merchants from Greece and Phoenicia, and the Persian heartland alike, haggling over dyed wool, worked metal, wine, olive oil, and the countless small luxuries that flowed along trade networks stretching in every direction. In Bactria, far to the northeast, in the mountainous lands of what is now Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, the satrap governed a frontier province, a place of fortified cities and long camel caravans, where Persian authority met the edge of the vast steppe lands and their nomadic horse peoples, sometimes allies, sometimes raiders, always a presence that had to be carefully managed rather than simply conquered outright. For the steppe swallowed armies the way the sea swallows ships that sail too far from shore, and far to the east, in the Indus Valley, the satrap governed the wealthiest province of all. According to the tribute lists that survive from Darius's reign, a land whose gold dust, brought down from the rivers of the Himalayan foothills, was said to be so abundant that Indian tribute to the Persian crown exceeded that of every other province combined. Ret now, and let your imagination wander through the royal court itself, the shifting seasonal capital where all these threads of empire eventually gathered. When winter came, the king and his court travelled to Susa, in the warmer lowlands of Elam, where the Karkare River provided relief from the heat, and where Darius had built a grand palace, its foundations, according to an inscription Darius himself left behind, laid with materials gathered from every corner of the empire: cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Bactria and Sardis, precious stones from Sogdiana and India, ivory from Ethiopia and India both, and skilled craftsmen, stone workers, goldsmiths, and woodworkers drawn from Ionia, Media, Egypt, and Babylon, all working together under Persian direction to raise a single building that was, in its very construction, a physical embodiment of the empire's diversity united under one throne. When the heat of summer came, the court moved north and into the mountains to Ecbatana, the old Median capital, where the air was cooler and where, according to later Greek accounts, concentric rings of walls, one within the other, protected an inner citadel roofed, some claimed, in silver and gold, though such accounts likely exaggerate for effect, the way distant wonders always grow larger in the retelling. And in spring, for the great Nowruz festival, marking the Persian New Year, the court gathered at Persepolis itself, for the ceremony that the carved reliefs on its grand staircases still commemorate today, the procession of tribute-bearers from every subject nation, arriving to renew, in a sense, the covenant between the king and his empire for another year. Let your mind rest a moment on the women of this court, so often left out of the old histories, which were, after all, written almost entirely by men, for audiences of men, recording the deeds that men considered worth recording. And yet Persian royal women held real, and sometimes very considerable influence, particularly within the palace itself, in ways the surviving Greek sources, written by outsiders looking in with a mixture of fascination and suspicion, only partly capture. Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and wife of Darius, is remembered in later tradition as a formidable figure at court, her support believed by some ancient writers to have been instrumental in securing Darius's claim to the throne, and later in influencing the succession of her own son, Xerxes, to the kingship over other possible claimants. Parysatis, a queen of a later generation, is described in the surviving accounts, admittedly written by hostile or at least skeptical Greek observers, as a shrewd and occasionally ruthless political operator within the royal family, deeply involved in the intense and sometimes lethal rivalries between royal princes competing for eventual succession to the throne. These were not simply decorative figures confined to some distant harem, though the harem itself, the private quarters of the royal women, was indeed a real institution, one that later Greek writers, fascinated and somewhat scandalized by what they imagined happening behind its walls, wrote about at great and not always reliable length. What we can say with more confidence, based on administrative records that have survived from Persepolis itself, small clay tablets recording rations and payments, is that royal and noble Persian women controlled substantial estates in their own right, oversaw considerable stores of grain, wine, and livestock, employed their own officials and workers, and in some documented cases travelled independently with their own retinues and received wages and provisions on a scale comparable to significant male officials. The picture that emerges When we look past the more sensational later Greek accounts and toward the quieter administrative record, is of women who held genuine economic and social standing within Persian elite society. Even if the loudest surviving voices, the ones writing the grand political narratives, remained almost entirely male. Let your thoughts turn now, softly, toward the soldiers who made all of this possible, or at least made it defensible, for an empire this vast could not survive on administration and tolerance alone. At the very heart of the Persian military stood an elite infantry corps that Greek writers called the Immortals, a name that has echoed down through the centuries with a kind of eerie glamour, though the reality behind it was rather more practical than mystical. The corps numbered, according to Herodotus, exactly 10,000 men, and whenever a soldier among them fell in battle, or died of illness, or grew too old for service, he was immediately replaced by another, so that the total strength of the unit never visibly changed, never dropped even for a single day, a detail that gave rise to the name. Since to a distant observer, it might have seemed as though the same 10,000 men simply never died at all. These soldiers wore, according to the surviving descriptions and the glazed brick reliefs that once decorated the palace walls at Susa, brightly coloured robes, gold jewellery, and carried spears whose butts were fashioned, for the officers at least, into golden pomegranates, a small detail of ornament that tells us something about how deeply the Persian elite valued visible splendour even on the battlefield. War conducted not only as violence but as spectacle, as a demonstration of the wealth and order that stood behind the king's authority. Beneath the Immortals, the broader Persian army was drawn, in the manner of the empire itself, from every corner of its territory. Levies of Median cavalry, Bactrian horsemen skilled with the bow, Egyptian marines who crewed much of the fleet, Phoenician sailors whose ships were, by common agreement among ancient writers, the finest in the Mediterranean world, Indian units fighting with weapons and tactics unfamiliar to soldiers from the western half of the empire, Ethiopian archers, Arab camel riders, each contingent dressed in its own distinctive fashion, speaking its own language, fighting according to its own tradition, all gathered beneath a single royal standard for a single campaign. This diversity was, in its way, both the empire's great strength and, eventually, one of its quiet vulnerabilities, for an army assembled from dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different tongues, required extraordinary coordination to function as a single fighting force, and in the heat and chaos of actual battle, that coordination sometimes faltered in ways that a smaller, more uniform army, like the disciplined Greek hoplite formations the Persians would eventually face, did not. Let your breathing settle again, slow and even, as we turn now toward the artisans and craftsmen whose work filled the empire's palaces and the homes of its wealthier citizens with beauty. Persian metalwork of this era reached a level of refinement that later collectors and museums across the world still marvel at today. Drinking vessels called rhytons, shaped like the curved horn of a ram or the head of a lion or a winged griffin, were worked in gold and silver with extraordinary precision, their surfaces sometimes gilded, sometimes inlaid with semi-precious stones, brought along trade routes from as far away as the mountains of Afghanistan, where the deep blue stone called lapis lazuli was quarried in mines that had already been worked for thousands of years by the time Cyrus was born. Persian jewellery favoured bold, symmetrical designs, bracelets ending in the carved heads of lions or ibexes, necklaces of gold beads and coloured stone, earrings shaped like small pendant discs that caught the light as their wearer moved. Persian textiles, too, were prized far beyond the empire's own borders. Wool dyed in rich purples, made from a costly dye extracted, drop by careful drop, from a particular kind of sea snail found along the Phoenician coast, was reserved largely for royalty and the highest nobility, while deep reds and warm ochre yellows, achieved through more common plant-based dyes, coloured the clothing of the broader elite. Patterns of animals locked in combat, a lion attacking a bull, a griffin seizing a stag, recurred again and again in Persian textile and metalwork alike. And some scholars believe these images carried a deeper symbolic meaning, tied to the Zoroastrian vision of a cosmos locked in eternal struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, truth and the lie. And then there were the gardens. If you take only one image from this long night of history and carry it with you into your own dreams, let it perhaps be this one. The Persian kings and the wealthy nobility who imitated them built formal walled gardens called paradiesa in Old Persian, divided by channels of flowing water into 4 quadrants, planted with fruit trees, roses, and shade-giving cypress, populated sometimes with tame gazelle or other gentle animals kept for the pleasure of walking among them. These gardens were not merely decorative. They represented, in miniature, an ordered and cultivated version of paradise itself, water-tamed and channeled, rather than left to flood or fail, plants arranged in careful geometric harmony rather than left to grow wild. A small enclosed world of peace and abundance carved deliberately out of a landscape that could, beyond the garden walls, be harsh and unforgiving. It is from this old Persian word, paradiesa, carried first into Greek, then into other languages across the centuries, that we eventually receive our own English word, paradise. Every time that word is spoken anywhere in the world today, in a hymn, in a conversation, in a place name on a map, it carries within it a small, quiet echo of a Persian king's private garden, walled and green and cool, more than 2,500 years gone. Let your mind drift, too, back to the sacred fire altars and the faith that shaped so much of how the Persians understood their place in the universe. Zoroastrian belief, whatever its precise origins in the deep past, imagined existence as an ongoing cosmic drama, a struggle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, source of light, order and truth, and a destructive spirit associated with darkness, chaos, and the lie. Every human being, in this understanding, was called upon to choose a side in this struggle, not through blind ritual alone, but through the active practice of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. A threefold ethical formula that appears again and again across surviving Zoroastrian texts, and that some scholars believe influenced later religious and philosophical traditions across the ancient world, though the exact lines of influence remain a subject of careful and ongoing scholarly debate. Fire held a central place in this worship, not as an object of worship itself, but as the purest physical symbol of Ahura Mazda's truth and light, and so fire altars burned in temples across the Persian world, tended endlessly, day and night, by priests called magi, a word that has travelled an extraordinarily long journey through history and language, surviving today in our own English words, magic and magician, a faint and somewhat distorted echo of Persian priests who were, in their own time, understood not as sorcerers but as careful, learned keepers of sacred flame and sacred knowledge, astronomers and ritual specialists whose reputation for wisdom travelled westward into Greek, and later into broader European tradition, eventually finding its way in a much later era entirely into a Christian nativity story about wise men from the east following a star. Let us return now, slowly, to the story of the Greek wars and linger a while longer in their unfolding, because these events, more than almost any others in the long life of the Persian Empire, shaped how later ages would remember Persia at all. The trouble began, as we said, in Ionia, along the coast of what is now western Turkey, where Greek cities like Miletus had lived under Persian rule since the days of Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, more than a generation earlier. By 499 before our era, a new generation had grown up under Persian governance. A generation that remembered stories, perhaps embellished with each retelling, of a time when their cities had governed themselves. A tyrant of Miletus named Aristagoras, driven perhaps as much by personal ambition and a failed military venture as by any deep principle, stirred these cities into open revolt against Persian authority and appealed to the Greek mainland for help. Sparta, the most militarily disciplined of the Greek city-states, declined to send aid, its kings unwilling to commit soldiers to a distant cause across the sea. But Athens, along with the smaller city of Eretria, sent a modest fleet, and Athenian soldiers took part in a raid that burned the city of Sardis, the old Lydian capital, and now a major centre of Persian provincial administration, to the ground. The revolt itself was eventually crushed by Persian forces after several years of fighting, the rebellious cities brought back under control, Miletus itself severely punished. But the burning of Sardis was not forgotten at the Persian court, and it planted, in the mind of King Darius, a determination to punish Athens directly for its interference in what he considered strictly internal Persian affairs. In 490 before our era, Darius sent a force across the Aegean Sea, a punitive expedition rather than a full-scale invasion, intended to subdue Athens and Eretria and reassert clear Persian authority over the troublesome Greek mainland cities. Eretria fell quickly, its population deported. The Persian force then landed on the plain of Marathon, some 26 miles from Athens itself, a location chosen, according to later accounts, on the advice of an exiled former Athenian tyrant who hoped Persian support might restore him to power in his home city. The Athenian army that marched out to meet them was small, reinforced only by a contingent from the tiny neighbouring city of Plataea, a gesture of loyalty that Athens would remember gratefully for generations afterward. Sparta, again, had promised aid but delayed its arrival, its soldiers reportedly unwilling to march before a religious festival then underway had properly concluded, arriving, according to Herodotus, only after the battle itself was already decided. The Athenian general Miltiades, who had himself once served the Persian Empire before returning to Athens, understood Persian tactics well and arranged the Athenian line with weakened centre but reinforced flanks, a formation that, when the two armies finally clashed, allowed the Athenian wings to crush the Persian flanks and then turn inward, encircling the Persian centre in a manoeuvre that has been studied by military historians for well over 2,000 years since. The Persian force broke and fled back to its ships, leaving, according to the ancient count, some 6,400 dead upon the field against a reported Athenian loss of fewer than 200. Numbers that modern historians treat with appropriate caution, but which nonetheless reflect a genuine and striking Athenian victory. Let here a moment and consider what this battle meant, and did not mean. To the Persian court, Marathon was a disappointing but entirely survivable setback in one distant corner of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Darius, according to the ancient sources, began at once preparing a far larger expedition to finish what the first had failed to accomplish, but died before it could be launched, leaving the task and the grievance to his son Xerxes. Xerxes spent years in careful preparation, gathering soldiers and supplies from every corner of the empire, having his engineers construct a pontoon bridge of lashed-together boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, so that his army could cross on foot rather than by ship, and, when a storm destroyed the first attempt at this bridge, ordering, according to Herodotus's vivid and likely embellished account, that the sea itself be whipped and cast with chains as punishment for its defiance, a story that later ages have sometimes taken as evidence of Xerxes' arrogance, though it may equally reflect the kind of ritual gesture meant to demonstrate royal command over even the natural world that ancient Near Eastern kingship often employed. The invasion, launched in 480 before our era, was staggering in scale, whatever the true numbers involved, and the Greek cities that chose to resist rather than submit, a coalition led jointly by Athens and Sparta, despite the long rivalry between them, understood they faced overwhelming odds. Their strategy centered on delaying the Persian advance at narrow points where superior Persian numbers would matter less, and the first and most famous of these delaying actions came at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass where the mountains pressed close against the sea, leaving barely enough room for a handful of men to stand shoulder to shoulder, there for 3 days, a force that modern estimates place at somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 Greek soldiers from various cities, though popular memory has fixed overwhelmingly on the 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas, held the pass against repeated Persian assaults, the narrow ground neutralizing the advantage of Persian numbers and allowing Greek discipline and heavier armor to hold the line. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, watched several days of failed assaults with mounting frustration, his elite immortals themselves thrown back with losses, before a local resident, a man named Ephialtes, whose name has become, in the Greek language ever since, a byword for traitor, revealed to the Persians a hidden mountain path that allowed a detachment to circle behind the Greek position. Learning that he had been outflanked, and that his position was now hopeless, Leonidas is said to have dismissed the bulk of the remaining Greek forces to fight another day, and remained himself, with his 300 Spartans and a small number of other Greeks who chose to stay, to fight to the last man, buying precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Let this image settle quietly in the dark, without judgment on either side, simply as it was. Men on both sides of that narrow pass believed in their own way that they were fighting for something worth dying for, whether that was the freedom of their home cities or the honor and command of their king. History remembers Thermopylae today almost entirely from the Greek perspective, and it is worth remembering, gently, that Persian soldiers too, conscripts from Bactria and Egypt and a dozen other provinces, died in that pass, far from anything they would have called home, and that their deaths too, however little we know of them individually, were real. The path to Athens now open, Xerxes' army marched south, and the city, evacuated in advance by its population on the advice of the Athenian statesman Themistocles, was burned. But Themistocles had convinced his fellow Athenians to place their trust not in the walls of their city, but in their navy, and it was at sea, in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, that the war's true turning point arrived. Themistocles lured the larger but less maneuverable Persian fleet into the confined waters of the strait, where numbers mattered less than skill, and where the more agile Greek triremes could ram and disable Persian ships one by one in the crowded, chaotic waters. Xerxes himself is said to have watched the battle from a golden throne, set upon a hillside, overlooking the strait, expecting to witness a Persian triumph, and watching instead as the day wore on, a catastrophic Persian defeat unfold beneath him, with his fleet shattered and his supply lines across the Aegean now vulnerable. Xerxes returned to Persia with much of his army, leaving a substantial force under a general named Mardonius to continue the campaign the following year. That force met the combined Greek armies at Plataea in 479 before our era and was decisively defeated, effectively ending the Persian attempt to conquer mainland Greece, though Persian influence and intermittent conflict along the Aegean coast and among the Greek cities would continue, in various forms, for another century and a half. Breathe slowly now, and let this long chapter of war settle gently behind you. It occupied, in truth, only a handful of years within the centuries-long span of Persian imperial history, and yet because it was the Greeks who wrote the histories that survived most fully into later ages, this brief conflict came to define, for much of the Western world for the next 2,500 years, almost the entire image of what Persia was. Let us drift now into the quieter, less remembered century that followed, the long, slow afternoon of the Persian Empire, when no great foreign war defined the age, but when the machinery of court and succession turned, year after year, sometimes smoothly, sometimes with sudden and startling violence. Xerxes, as we have said, was murdered in his own palace in 465 before our era, the victim of a conspiracy led by a court official who had grown to believe, whether rightly or wrongly, that his own position was threatened. His son Artaxerxes, the first king to bear that name, took the throne amid the confusion that followed, and ruled for more than 4 decades. A long and largely stable reign, remembered less for dramatic conquest than for careful administration. The kind of quiet, competent governance that rarely makes for exciting history, but that in truth kept an empire of this size functioning smoothly for the benefit of the millions who lived within it. After Artaxerxes came Darius II, and then, in 404 before our era, Artaxerxes II ascended to the throne. And it is here that one of the most remarkable and best documented episodes of later Persian history unfolds. Remembered today largely because a young Greek soldier and writer named Xenophon happened to take part in it, and later wrote a detailed account of his experience. Artaxerxes II had a younger brother, Cyrus, sometimes called Cyrus the Younger to distinguish him from the empire's founder so many generations before, who governed as satrap over a rich portion of Persian Anatolia, and who believed, with the confidence common to ambitious younger siblings throughout history, that he, rather than his elder brother, deserved to sit upon the Persian throne. Cyrus the Younger gathered an army that included, alongside Persian and other Asian troops, a substantial force of Greeks mercenaries, some 10,000 strong hardened soldiers drawn from various Greek city-states, men who fought not for any particular loyalty to Persia, or to Cyrus personally but for pay, and the promise of further reward. This combined force marched deep into the Persian heartland, deep into Mesopotamia, and met the forces of Artaxerxes II at a place called Cunaxa, not far from Babylon, in 401 before our era. In the chaos of that battle, Cyrus the Younger, spotting his brother the king across the field, rode directly at him in a bold and desperate attempt to end the war with a single stroke, wounding Artaxerxes but being killed himself in the attempt, his rebellion collapsing in an instant with his death. The way so many ambitions built on a single roll of the dice collapse the moment fortune turns against them. This left the 10,000 Greek mercenaries stranded deep within a hostile empire, their employer dead, their Persian allies scattered, hundreds of miles from any friendly territory, surrounded by Persian forces who might, quite reasonably, have simply destroyed them where they stood. What followed instead has become one of the great adventure narratives to survive from the ancient world, as these 10,000 soldiers, under a new leadership that included the young Xenophon himself, fought and marched their way north across hostile Persian and Armenian and Kurdish territory, through mountains and winter snow, harassed constantly by Persian cavalry and local hill tribes, until at last, after a march of many hundreds of miles, they reached the shore of the Black Sea, and, according to Xenophon's own account, cried out in joy at the sight of the water, the sea, knowing that from there they could find passage home by ship among fellow Greeks. Xenophon's account of this journey, later known as the Anabasis, or the march up country, offers us something quite rare and valuable, here in the slow dark hours of this story, a detailed eyewitness portrait of the Persian Empire's interior, its landscapes, its provincial administration, its scattered peoples, written not by a court historian composing a formal record for posterity, but by a soldier simply trying, day by day, to survive and lead his comrades home. It shows us an empire that even in this era of dynastic strife and rebellion at the very centre of power remained, at the level of countryside and province and daily administration, functioning, populated, largely at peace with itself, however troubled its royal house had become. Let this be a gentle reminder as we drift further into the story. Empires can survive remarkable turbulence at the top, brother rising against brother, palace conspiracies, contested successions, and still continue, for generations, to provide the ordinary daily structure within which millions of unremarkable, peaceful lives quietly continue. The Persian Empire, after Cunaxa, endured for more than another 60 years, through further reigns, further court intrigues, occasional regional rebellions in Egypt and elsewhere that were sometimes suppressed and sometimes, for a time, successful, before Egypt was eventually reconquered under a later Artaxerxes. It was an empire that had, by this point, existed for nearly 2 centuries, longer than the entire history of certain modern nations, longer than the gap between our own time and the founding of the United States. An empire whose ordinary continuity, whose roads still maintained, whose taxes still collected, whose temples still tended, mattered more to the daily lives of its people than the palace dramas that later historians, drawn always to conflict and intrigue, chose to record in such detail. Let us return one more time to the very beginning of this long story, and let ourselves linger there a little longer than we did before, because origin stories, even half-legendary ones, have a particular power to soothe the mind towards sleep, the way a favourite old tale told at bedtime always does. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing perhaps a century after Cyrus's death, gathered several different versions of the story of the great king's birth and childhood, admitting himself that he was not entirely certain which, if any, were true, and passing them along anyway, the way any careful historian of legend must. In the version he found most convincing, the Median king Astyages, Cyrus's own grandfather, dreamed one night that a vine grew from his daughter's womb and spread until its branches covered all of Asia. Troubled by what his dream interpreters told him this vision meant, that his own grandson would one day overthrow him, Astyages arranged for the infant to be given to a trusted official named Harpagus, with instructions that the child be killed. Harpagus, unwilling to carry out the deed with his own hands, passed the infant instead to a herdsman, instructing him to expose the child on a lonely mountainside, to leave it for the wolves and the cold night air, to do what Harpagus himself could not bring himself to do. But the herdsman's wife, it is said, had just lost a child of her own, stillborn or dead soon after birth, and pleaded with her husband to save the royal infant and raise it as their own, substituting the body of their own lost child for the one they had been ordered to expose. And so, in this old story, the boy who would become Cyrus the Great grew up not in a palace but in a herdsman's simple home, tending flocks on the hillsides of Media, learning perhaps in those early years something about patience, about the land, about ordinary people and their ordinary struggles, that a child raised only within palace walls might never have learned at all. The story continues that the truth eventually came out, as such stories in old legends always seem to, when the boy, playing at being king among the other village children in some rough game, punished a nobleman's son too harshly for disobeying his pretend royal commands, drawing the attention of the boy's father and eventually of Astyages himself, who recognized in the child's bearing and features something unmistakably familiar. Astyages, the story goes, chose in the end not to have the child killed after this discovery, but exacted a terrible private revenge instead on Harpagus, the official who had failed to carry out his original order, before allowing young Cyrus to be sent away to his true family among the Persians, to be raised, from that point onward, as the prince he truly was. We cannot know, drifting here in the soft dark so many centuries later, how much of this story is history, and how much is the kind of legend that grows up naturally around any figure whose later life became large enough to require an equally large beginning. Ancient peoples across many cultures told similar stories about their great founders, an exposed infant, a humble upbringing, a hidden royal identity eventually revealed, and scholars have long noted the recurring pattern. But whether or not the details are literally true, the story tells us something real about how the Persians themselves wished to remember their founder, not as a man born already grand and untouchable, but as someone who came from close to the ordinary earth, who may have known, even briefly, what it was to tend sheep in the cold morning air of the Median hills, before he ever dreamed of empires. Let your mind rest gently on that image now. A boy on a hillside before dawn, breath visible in the cold air, watching over animals that depend entirely on his care, with no way of knowing that he will one day be remembered, 25 centuries later, as the founder of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. Let us walk now, slowly, alongside another traveller on this journey through the empire, not a king this time, nor a general, but simply a rider on the royal road, one of the relay messengers whose steady, tireless passage across the empire Darius's system had made possible. Imagine him setting out from a relay station at dusk, the sky above the Anatolian hills fading from orange to deep violet, a leather satchel of sealed clay tablets and folded parchment slung across his shoulder, containing perhaps routine tax reports from a distant satrap, perhaps something more urgent, word of unrest in a border province, a request for additional troops, a private letter from a nobleman to his family in another part of the empire. He knows this stretch of road well, has ridden it many times before, the packed earth surface, wide enough for wagons to pass one another, marked at intervals with stone pillars, recording the distance already travelled, and the distance yet to come, a detail of Persian engineering that later Roman road builders would themselves adopt and refine. Every so often, as the miles pass beneath his horse's steady hooves, he approaches another relay station, a modest fortified post where a fresh horse waits, already saddled, already fed and rested, tended by an official whose entire task in life is simply this: to keep horses ready at every hour of the day and night for exactly this purpose. The rider barely slows. He swings from his tired mount onto the fresh one, the satchel transferred in a single practiced motion, and is gone again into the darkness before his replacement horse has even settled from the change, the whole exchange taking perhaps no more than a minute or two, repeated at station after station across hundreds of miles, day into night into day again, until the message reaches its destination far faster than any single horse or rider could have carried it alone. Herodotus, writing of this system with evident admiration, noted that nothing mortal travels faster than these Persian couriers, and although he never actually wrote the exact words that later ages would attach to postal services in entirely different centuries and countries, the sentiment he expressed was genuine, and it reflects something the Persians themselves clearly took great pride in: the idea that their king's will, his justice, his commands, his knowledge of events across his vast domain, could move with a speed that made the empire feel, in some sense, smaller and more governable than its true size would otherwise allow. Think of this rider now as you drift toward your own rest tonight. Somewhere between two ancient cities, in the deep quiet of a night 25 centuries gone, hooves on packed earth, stars overhead unclouded by any light but their own, a small folded piece of parchment carrying words that mattered enormously to someone, somewhere, and that have long since crumbled to dust, forgotten, the message delivered, its urgency spent, its purpose fulfilled. The rider himself unremembered by name, one of countless quiet threads that held an empire together. Let us drift now toward Egypt, that ancient land along the Nile, already impossibly old by the time Persian ships and soldiers first arrived under Cambyses in 525 before our era. To conquer Egypt was to inherit a civilization that had already built its pyramids some 2,000 years earlier, that had already produced dozens of pharaonic dynasties, that possessed a religious and administrative tradition so deep and so specific that any foreign ruler who wished to govern it successfully had little real choice but to work carefully within its existing forms, rather than attempting to sweep them away entirely. The Persian kings understood this, for the most part, and so Cambyses, and later Darius, allowed themselves to be presented, within Egypt itself, in the traditional visual language of pharaonic kingship, carved into temple walls wearing the double crown that symbolized rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, shown making offerings to Egyptian gods, their names written in ancient Egyptian in the formal hieroglyphic style long used for royal titulary. Darius in particular seems to have taken considerable interest in Egyptian religious institutions, and inscriptions survive recording his support for the restoration of an Egyptian temple and his patronage of Egyptian priests, gestures calculated, no doubt, to secure the loyalty of a powerful and ancient priestly class, whose cooperation mattered enormously to any ruler, hoping to govern the Nile Valley peacefully. And yet Persian rule in Egypt was not without its tensions, and Egyptian revolts against Persian authority flared up more than once across the 2 centuries of Achaemenid control, briefly succeeding in establishing independent Egyptian dynasties before Persian forces eventually reasserted control, a pattern that reminds us, gently, that the tolerance and accommodation the Persian Empire practiced was always balanced against, and ultimately backed by, the reality of military force whenever cooperation broke down. Let your thoughts turn now toward another people whose story became entwined, in a way that would echo across thousands of years, with the Persian Empire, the exiled community of Judeans living in Babylon, taken there decades before Cyrus's arrival, after the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem and carried much of the Judean elite away into captivity. When Cyrus took Babylon in 539 before our era, his policy, as we have already heard, was to allow captive and displaced peoples to return to their homelands and restore their traditional forms of worship. And the Hebrew Bible, in its book of Ezra, remembers this moment with striking specificity, recording what is presented as an actual proclamation of Cyrus, granting the Judean exiles permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, and even, according to the account, returning sacred temple vessels that had been carried off to Babylon decades earlier. Modern scholars debate the precise historical details of this account, whether the specific wording preserved in the biblical texts reflects an actual Persian royal decree or a somewhat later religious retelling shaped by the theological concerns of the community that eventually wrote it down. But the broader outline, that Cyrus's general policy of religious tolerance and permitting displaced peoples to return home, did indeed benefit the Judean community, and that construction of a second temple in Jerusalem did proceed under Persian rule, and with at least some degree of Persian support, particularly under later kings like Darius, is widely accepted among historians studying this period. It is a remarkable thing to consider, drifting here in the quiet dark, that a Persian king from a small kingdom in the Iranian hills is remembered, in the sacred scripture of a people whose homeland lay 1,000 miles from his own, not as a conqueror but almost as an instrument of divine mercy, called in one passage of the biblical text by the very word normally reserved for an anointed king, an honor given to no other foreign ruler anywhere in that entire body of scripture. Rest with that thought a while longer. Whatever the precise political calculations behind Cyrus's policies, calculations that surely included practical concerns about securing loyalty among newly conquered peoples, rather than pure disinterested kindness alone, the effect of those policies rippled outward across centuries and across cultures in ways that Cyrus himself could never have fully anticipated, remembered still today, 25 centuries later. Whenever this ancient story is read aloud in synagogues and churches across the world, let your thoughts settle now on the table itself, on food and drink, and the particular warmth of Persian hospitality, which ancient visitors from Greece and elsewhere remarked upon again and again, sometimes with genuine admiration, sometimes with a faint note of scandalized wonder at its sheer scale and extravagance. The royal table, according to the accounts that survive, drew provisions from across the entire breadth of the empire, a kind of edible map of Persian dominion laid out each evening before the king and his assembled court. Wine came from the vineyards of Syria and from the region around Lake Van in Armenia, prized above other vintages according to several ancient writers. Salt arrived from a particular desert oasis whose salt was considered especially fine. Water for the king's own drinking was said to be carried, boiled, and then carefully sealed in silver vessels. From a particular spring near Susa, believed to be especially pure, so that wherever the king travelled across his vast domain, he might always drink water from his own homeland, rather than whatever local source happened to be nearest. Whether this particular detail is entirely accurate or slightly embellished by later Greek writers fascinated by Persian luxury, it captures something true about the way Persian kingship performed its own grandeur. Every detail of royal life arranged to demonstrate that the king's reach and provision extended, quite literally, to the furthest corners of the world he ruled. Ordinary Persian hospitality, away from the royal court, though naturally far more modest, carried within it many of the same values, a deep cultural emphasis on generosity toward guests, on the sharing of bread and wine and roasted meat with visitors and travellers, an ethic of hospitality that persisted in the lands of ancient Persia long after the Achaemenid Empire itself had fallen, and that visitors to Iran still remark upon today, a thread of continuity stretching across 2,500 years, largely unbroken by all the political upheavals that came between. Herodotus records, with a mixture of admiration and mild bemusement, that the Persians were fond of discussing important matters of state twice, once while drunk on wine at a feast, and again the following day while sober, on the theory that a decision reached agreeably in both states of mind was more likely to be a sound one, a small detail that has amused readers for over 2,000 years, and that reveals, whether entirely accurate or slightly exaggerated, a Persian court culture that valued feasting and conversation, wine and deliberation together as part of the serious business of governing an empire, rather than treating pleasure and statecraft as separate and unrelated pursuits. Music, too, filled the halls of Persian palaces, though almost none of it survives to us now in any form we could actually hear. No notation, no instruments intact enough to reconstruct their sound with confidence, only occasional mentions in surviving texts of harps and lyres and drums, of singers performing at royal feasts, of a courtly culture that valued beauty in sound as much as in the visual splendor of gold and painted stone. Somewhere in the deep quiet of history, entire traditions of Persian court music, entire melodies once played beneath painted columns at Persepolis, have simply vanished, leaving behind only the barest suggestion that they ever existed at all, a reminder, gentle and a little sad, of how much of any civilization's daily beauty, its ordinary music and laughter and casual conversation, is lost entirely to time, leaving only the monuments and the written records of kings behind for us to study so many centuries later. Let your mind rest now, for a while, not on kings or battles at all, but simply on the land itself, the vast and varied landscape that the Persian Empire eventually came to hold within its borders, because the character of a place shapes the character of the people who live upon it, slowly, patiently. Across many generations, the way water shapes stone, the Iranian plateau, the heartland, from which Cyrus's family first rose, is a place of striking contrasts, high and dry, ringed by mountain ranges that trap what little moisture the winds carry inland from distant seas. To the north, the Alborz Mountains rise sharply, their peaks capped with snow through much of the year, separating the plateau from the low, humid coastline along the Caspian Sea, itself the largest enclosed body of water on Earth. Its waters strange and slightly brackish, neither quite sea nor quite lake. To the west, the Zagros Mountains run in long parallel ridges, folded and rugged, their valleys sheltering small farming communities that have grown wheat and barley and tended goats and sheep for many thousands of years longer, even than the Persian Empire itself existed, going back to some of the very earliest origins of agriculture anywhere on Earth. Between these mountain ranges, the interior plateau itself is largely arid, broken by two great salt deserts, the Dashti Kavir and the Dashti Lut, places of such extreme dryness and heat that little living thing can survive within their deepest reaches, vast cracked expanses of salt crust and wind-sculpted dunes that stretch, in places, as far as the eye can see in every direction, utterly silent, utterly still, the kind of landscape that seems, even today, to belong to some other and older world entirely. And yet, scattered around the edges of these deserts, and along the mountain valleys that channel what water there is down from the peaks, Persian civilization flourished, sustained by an ancient and ingenious system of underground water channels called qanats, tunnels dug sometimes for many miles beneath the desert surface, carrying water by gravity alone from underground aquifers near the mountains down to fields and villages far out in the otherwise inhospitable plain, an engineering achievement so effective, so perfectly adapted to this particular landscape, that qanats built more than 2,000 years ago still carry water to villages in modern Iran today, still tended and maintained across an unbroken span of use that very few human technologies anywhere in the world can claim to match. It is worth resting for a moment on the qanat, this quiet underground achievement, because it tells us something true about the character of Persian civilization that the golden palaces and carved stone reliefs, for all their splendor, do not quite capture on their own. This was a civilization built, at its foundation, on a deep and patient relationship with scarce water in a demanding landscape, on the careful, unglamorous, essential work of channeling and conserving and sharing a resource that could mean the difference between a thriving village and an abandoned one. The kings who built Persepolis and commanded armies that stretched from Greece to India ruled ultimately over a land that required this kind of humble ingenuity simply to sustain human life at all, and the empire's prosperity rested, in the end, as much on the quiet work of unnamed engineers digging qanats through solid rock as it did on the more visible achievements of kings and generals whose names alone survive in the history books. Further south and east, the land grows warmer, and along the coast of the Persian Gulf, humid air and date palm groves gave a very different character to daily life than the cold mountain winters of the north. It was through this southern coastline, and through the great rivers of Mesopotamia to the west, that Persian trade flowed outward into the wider ancient world, ships carrying goods down the Gulf toward India, and up the great rivers into the heart of Mesopotamia, and onward toward the Mediterranean. The empire, in other words, was never a single uniform landscape at all, but a vast patchwork of deserts and mountains and river valleys and coastlines, each with its own particular demands and its own particular rhythms of life, all of it, remarkably, held together under a single administrative system for the better part of 2 centuries. Let us return once more to Persepolis itself, and this time let us watch it being built, rather than admiring it already finished, because there is something quietly soothing in imagining the slow, patient labor that must have gone into raising such a place, stone upon careful stone, over the course of decades rather than years. The terrace upon which Persepolis stands was not a natural feature of the landscape, but a deliberate human creation, a vast raised platform, built against the base of a mountain called Ku'e Rahmat, levelled and reinforced with massive foundation stones, some of them so enormous that modern engineers still puzzle over exactly how Persian workers, using only wooden rollers, ropes, ramps of packed earth, and the coordinated muscle of many hundreds of labourers and draft animals, managed to move them into place at all. Quarries some miles distant supplied the pale grey limestone from which most of the platform and its buildings were built, stone cut using bronze and iron tools, worked with a precision that modern visitors still marvel at today, blocks fitted together so exactly, without any mortar at all in many places, that a knife blade could not be slipped between them. Even after 25 centuries of earthquakes and weathering, administrative tablets excavated at Persepolis itself, small clay records never meant for any eye but that of the palace treasury, give us a rare and quietly moving glimpse into the lives of the workers who built and maintained this place, recording rations of grain, wine and beer paid out to laborers of many different origins: Babylonians, Egyptians, Ionian Greeks, Lydians, Elamites and Persians themselves, working side by side on a single vast project. These records show payments made to both men and women, sometimes at different rates, and sometimes note additional rations provided to women who had recently given birth. A small human detail preserved by accident in a bureaucratic ledger, telling us that ordinary family life, birth and care, and the small kindnesses of provision continued quietly even in the shadow of these enormous royal ambitions. Skilled sculptors, whose individual names are almost entirely lost to us now, though a very few are known from inscriptions elsewhere in the empire, spent years carving the long relief processions along the grand staircases, each figure rendered with such careful individual attention, the particular fall of a cloak, the particular style of a headdress, the particular gift being carried, that art historians today can identify with confidence which delegation from which corner of the empire each carved figure represents. A Median noble in his rounded cap, an Arab in flowing robes leading a camel, an Ethiopian bringing an elephant tusk, a Scythian in trousers, an unusual and foreign garment to Persian eyes, bringing a fine cloak and bracelets as tribute. Each of these figures was carved by hand, slowly, patiently, over what must have been thousands of individual hours of careful work, by artisans whose own names have vanished into time, even as the fruits of their labour still stand today, weathered but recognizable, in the golden light of the Iranian sun. There is something worth carrying with you into your own rest tonight, in this image of patient, anonymous craftsmanship. So much of what endures from any civilization, the buildings we still admire, the roads we still in some places still travel, the very language we still speak, was built not by the kings whose names survive in the history books, but by countless unnamed workers, sculptors, farmers, water engineers, and administrators, whose individual lives, whose individual weariness at the end of a long day's labour, whose individual small satisfactions in a task well finished, have almost entirely disappeared from memory, and yet whose combined patient effort, stone by careful stone, root by careful root, still shapes the world we live in today. Even when we no longer remember a single one of their names, let your gaze rest now, in your mind's eye, upward, toward the night sky as it must have looked from a rooftop in Babylon or Susa or Persepolis, so many centuries ago, unspoiled by any light but starlight and the small warm glow of oil lamps and cooking fires below, because it was here, in this same sky you might glimpse tonight if you stepped outside, that some of the priests we have already met, the Magi, spent so much of their patient, careful attention Babylon, absorbed into the Persian Empire under Cyrus, had already possessed for many centuries before Cyrus's arrival, one of the most sophisticated traditions of astronomical observation anywhere in the ancient world. Priests and scholars who kept careful nightly records of the movements of the moon, the visible planets, and the fixed patterns of stars, tracking eclipses, predicting the recurring cycles of celestial movement with a mathematical precision that would not be matched again in some respects until many centuries later. Under Persian rule, this tradition continued and, if anything, deepened, Babylonian astronomical knowledge flowing outward through the empire's networks of trade and administration, eventually influencing Greek astronomy. And much later, Indian and Islamic astronomical traditions as well. One of the quieter but genuinely significant ways that Persian imperial unity allowed knowledge itself to travel farther and faster than it ever had before. The Persian Magi, priests of the Zoroastrian faith, held their own deep interest in the movements of the heavens, seeing in the orderly, predictable cycles of sun and moon and stars a physical reflection of the cosmic order and truth embodied by Ahura Mazda himself, the regular turning of the seasons, the reliable return of spring after winter, understood not merely as natural phenomena, but as visible evidence of a universe governed, ultimately, by truth and light rather than chaos and the lie. It is a beautiful thought to rest with. Hear in your own quiet dark tonight that a people who tended sacred fire as a symbol of truth also looked upward, night after night, at the same slow-wheeling stars that turn above you even now, and found in that vast silent movement a source of comfort and meaning rather than fear. Centuries later, a story would grow up, far to the west, in a very different religious tradition entirely, of wise men from the east, magi, following a particular star toward a particular birth, traveling with gifts of gold and rare fragrant resins toward a manger in a small town. Scholars continue to debate the precise historical basis of this story, and it would be a mistake to draw too straight a line across so many centuries and so much retelling. But the word itself, magi, carries within it, whatever the literal truth of that particular later story, a genuine echo of these Persian priest astronomers, watchers of the sky, keepers of sacred flame, whose reputation for deep and careful wisdom travelled far beyond the borders of Persia itself, and outlived, by a very long measure indeed, the empire that first gave them their name. Let us go back once more gently to the troubled years just before Darius secured the Persian throne, because the story of how he came to power, carved by his own order high on a cliff face for all of later history to read, tells us a great deal about how Persian kingship justified and understood itself after the death of Cambyses, son of Cyrus, in 522 before our era. The empire fell into a period of genuine crisis, several different claimants rising in different provinces, each insisting upon his own right to rule, the details murky and disputed even in the ancient sources themselves, clouded further by the fact that our primary account comes from Darius's own version of events, carved at his own command, and therefore quite naturally presented in the manner most favourable to his own legitimacy. According to this account, a man claiming to be Cambyses' own brother Bardia had seized the throne, but Darius maintained that this man was in fact an impostor, a magus, who had taken advantage of the real Bardia's earlier secret death to claim the throne under a false identity. Darius, together with a small group of fellow Persian noblemen, moved against this claimant and killed him, and Darius then proclaimed himself the rightful king, moving swiftly and decisively to suppress a wave of rebellions that broke out across the empire in the chaotic months that followed, in Media, in Babylon, in Elam, in Parthia, and elsewhere, as various local leaders saw in the crisis an opportunity to break away from Persian rule entirely. Darius records all of this, in remarkable and self-consciously dramatic detail, on a great inscription carved high on a limestone cliff at a place called Behistan, along the ancient road connecting Babylon to the Iranian plateau, positioned deliberately at a height that made it extremely difficult, if not practically impossible, for anyone to alter or deface the text after it was carved. A kind of permanent, tamper-resistant broadcast to eternity. The inscription is written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, allowing readers across different linguistic communities within the empire to understand its message, and it includes a large relief carving showing Darius standing triumphant, his foot resting upon the chest of the defeated pretender, while a row of other captured rebel leaders stand bound before him, their names and the false claims each had made carefully labelled beside their carved figures. Darius frames his entire account of these events in the language of truth against the lie, the same moral framework that ran through Zoroastrian belief, presenting himself not merely as a victorious claimant to a contested throne, but as the rightful champion of cosmic and political order against the chaos and deception of false pretenders. Whatever the precise historical truth behind these events, murky and self-serving as any account written entirely by the eventual winner must necessarily be. The inscription itself stands today as one of the single most important sources for understanding not only the political history of this period, but the very language of Old Persian, since its trilingual text later allowed 19th century scholars, working with tremendous patience over many years, to finally decipher Old Persian cuneiform script, and through it, eventually, Babylonian cuneiform as well, unlocking in the process the ability to read thousands of other ancient texts from Mesopotamia that had lain silent and unreadable for well over 2,000 years, waiting patiently in the earth and in museum collections for someone, eventually, to learn to listen to them again. Let us walk once more, slowly alongside Cambyses, the son who inherited Cyrus's throne and Cyrus's ambitions both, as his army marched south along the eastern edge of the Sinai Desert in 525 before our era. Water carried carefully in skins and jars across a stretch of land so dry and unforgiving that later ancient writers marveled at the logistical achievement of moving an entire army across it at all, said to have been arranged in part through a careful alliance with Arab tribes who controlled the desert wells and agreed, for a price, to guide and provision the Persian force along its difficult route. Egypt at this time was ruled by a young pharaoh named Psamtik III, who had inherited the throne from his father only a few months earlier, and whose forces met the Persian army at a place called Pelusium, near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, in a battle that Egyptian tradition, according to later Greek writers, remembered with a certain bitter wonder. Herodotus, visiting the battlefield generations later, claimed he could still see, scattered across the sand, the bones of the fallen from both sides, and noted, with the kind of curious anecdotal detail that makes his histories such a pleasure to read even today, that Persian skulls found on the field were said to be noticeably thinner and more easily broken than Egyptian ones, which local guides attributed, whether accurately or not, to the Egyptian custom of shaving their heads from childhood and exposing them to the sun, thickening the bone, against the Persian custom of wearing turbans and covering the head. Whatever the truth of that particular detail, the battle itself was a decisive Persian victory, and Egypt, a civilization already ancient beyond easy imagining even in Cambyses' own time, its earliest pyramids already older, relative to him, than the entirety of the United States is old relative to us today, became a Persian satrapy, governed thereafter, as we have already heard, with careful attention to Egyptian religious sensitivity and traditional pharaonic ceremony, even as ultimate political authority now rested with a foreign king from the Iranian plateau, thousands of miles away. Ancient Greek sources, not always friendly toward Persia, tell stories of Cambyses' later years in Egypt as increasingly erratic and even cruel, accusing him at various points of insulting Egyptian religious customs, of a failed and disastrous military expedition into Nubia to the south, and of a lost army swallowed entirely by a desert sandstorm during an attempted campaign toward the oasis of Siwa, an army whose fate remains, even today, a genuine subject of archaeological curiosity and occasional dramatic, not entirely verified, claims of discovery in the shifting sands of the Western Desert. Modern historians treat many of these more lurid Greek accounts of Cambyses with real caution, noting that they come to us largely through Herodotus, writing more than half a century later, drawing on second-hand Egyptian informants, who may well have had their own reasons, resentment at foreign rule chief among them, to remember a foreign conqueror in the least flattering light available. The truth of Cambyses' character, whatever it truly was, has likely been softened in some respects and darkened in others by more than 2,000 years of retelling, the way any distant historical figure's reputation is slowly reshaped by each generation that inherits and reinterprets his story. Let your thoughts settle now on the question of justice itself, on how a king ruling so vast and varied an empire attempted, in practice, to be fair, or at least to be seen as fair, to the millions of people living under his authority. A phrase survives, echoed later in the biblical book of Esther, which is itself set at the Persian royal court, describing certain royal decrees as being written according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be altered. A phrase that has passed down into English usage even today, describing anything considered fixed and beyond changing. Whatever the precise legal reality behind this phrase, it points towards something the Persian kings clearly wished to project. The idea that royal justice, once formally issued and sealed, carried a weight and permanence that even the king himself could not simply undo on a passing whim. A principle that, if genuinely practiced with any consistency, would have offered real and valuable protection to subjects across the empire against arbitrary and constantly shifting royal caprice. Local courts across the empire, from what evidence survives, continued to apply local legal traditions in most matters. Babylonian law in Babylonia, Egyptian law in Egypt, the customary law of each province largely respected and left in place, so long as it did not directly conflict with Persian royal authority or the payment of tribute. Royal judges, appointed directly by the king, existed to handle matters of particular importance, or matters involving the crown itself, and later Greek writers describe, with evident respect, the seriousness and formality with which Persian royal justice was administered, judges holding their position, according to one striking story preserved by Herodotus, for life unless found guilty of corruption, in which case the punishment was severe indeed. One judge said to have been flayed alive for accepting a bribe in a judgment, his skin then stretched across the seat of the judgment chair itself, and his own son, appointed to the position in his place, required to sit each day upon his father's skin, as a permanent and visceral reminder of the seriousness with which royal justice was meant to be upheld. It is a grim story, and perhaps an exaggerated one, the kind of vivid moral tale that ancient historians were fond of, including as instructive anecdote rather than strictly verified fact. But it speaks to something the Persian imperial system valued, at least in principle, a justice system understood as sacred, as an extension of the same cosmic truth that Zoroastrian belief held so central. Corruption in judgment, treated not merely as a civil offence, but as a kind of embodiment of the lie itself, the very force that stood opposed, in Persian religious thought, to truth and light and proper order. If you find yourself drawn into these old stories the way we hope you are tonight, and if this kind of slow wandering through history helps you drift toward your own rest, do take just a moment, whenever you happen to be watching this, to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep bringing these long, quiet histories to you and to others who are looking for exactly this kind of calm before sleep. Let us think now, slowly and without judgment, about why an empire so vast, so wealthy, so long-lasting, so administratively sophisticated, could eventually fall, in the space of only a few short years, to an invading force so much smaller than its own available strength. Historians have offered many explanations across the centuries, and it is worth resting gently on a few of them here, not to reach any final verdict, but simply to turn the question over slowly in the mind, the way one might turn over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, examining it from several angles before setting it down again. Some point to the slow accumulation of court intrigue and disputed succession across the final Achaemenid century. The murders and rivalries among royal brothers and half-brothers that we glimpsed earlier in the story of Cyrus the Younger and his march toward Canaxa, arguing that this repeated instability at the very top of the empire's structure gradually weakened the coordination and trust needed to respond effectively to a serious external threat when one finally arrived. Others point to simple military and tactical evolution, noting that Macedonian infantry drilled for years under Philip, and then Alexander in the use of the long sarissa pike and coordinated phalanx tactics, combined with a superbly trained companion cavalry, represented a genuine leap forward in battlefield effectiveness that the more traditionally organized Persian forces, however numerous, struggled to counter on open ground. A reminder that sheer numbers, so often assumed to guarantee victory, have mattered far less throughout military history than discipline, training, and tactical innovation. Still others point to something more structural, arguing that the very tolerance and decentralization that had made the Persian Empire so stable and prosperous for so long, allowing satraps considerable local authority, allowing conquered peoples to largely retain their own customs and even their own local military forces also, meant that, when a serious crisis arrived, the empire lacked the kind of tightly centralized, rapidly mobilized single command structure that a smaller, more uniform Macedonian kingdom, with all power concentrated directly in the hands of one energetic young king, could bring to bear. Perhaps, in truth, no single explanation fully captures it, and perhaps that is itself a kind of lesson worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight. Great structures, whether empires or any other long-enduring human achievement, rarely fall for only one reason. They fall the way a great old tree falls, not from a single blow of the axe, but from many years of slow accumulated stress, drought here, disease there, storm damage in one season, insect decay working quietly and invisibly within the trunk across many more seasons after that, until finally, on some particular afternoon that seems, from the outside, entirely unremarkable, the tree simply gives way all at once, the culmination of forces that had, in truth, been building for a very long time before anyone standing nearby noticed anything was wrong at all. So what does this ancient empire mean to us now, so many centuries later, as you lie here in the dark, drifting slowly towards sleep? Perhaps it means this, that greatness, real greatness, is rarely built through cruelty alone. Cyrus's empire endured and grew, not simply because Persian armies were strong, though they were, but because Cyrus and Darius understood something that many conquerors before and after them did not, that people who are allowed to keep their gods, their customs, their languages, their own quiet dignity, will often serve an empire more faithfully than people who are only ever ruled through fear. Perhaps it means, too, that even the grandest human works, the tallest columns, the widest roads, the most magnificent painted halls, are all, in the end, temporary subject to fire and time, and the slow patient work of wind and rain across fallen stone, and yet something always survives, a word for paradise, a name remembered in an ancient sacred text, a festival of light still celebrated after 25 centuries, a story carried forward, told again in the dark to someone who was not yet born when it began, and who will pass it on, in turn, to someone not yet born today. Before we let this story rest completely, let us pause for one more quiet while at Persepolis itself, and consider what Xerxes himself, so often remembered only for the failed invasion of Greece, actually left behind him in stone, because a king's true legacy is rarely contained entirely within a single dramatic military campaign. However much later ages choose to remember him by it, it was Xerxes, continuing and expanding his father Darius's original building program, who raised the great gate of all nations at the entrance to the Persepolis terrace, a monumental gateway flanked by colossal stone figures of winged bulls with the bearded heads of men, a design drawing deliberately on much older Assyrian and Babylonian artistic traditions, absorbed by Persia the way Persia absorbed so much from the older civilizations it came to rule, and reshaped into something distinctly its own. An inscription at this gate, carved in Xerxes' own name, records his own building work in a formula echoing his father's inscriptions elsewhere in the empire, invoking Ahura Mazda's blessing upon the work and upon the king himself, a small but telling detail suggesting that whatever else Xerxes was, however later Greek tradition chose to caricature him as merely arrogant or impulsive, he understood himself, in his own words, carved for eternity into stone that still stands today. as a builder and a steward of his father's great unfinished project, not merely as a warrior. Xerxes also completed the great audience hall, the Apadana, that Darius had begun, and added his own royal palace to the terrace, a private residence somewhat smaller than the grand ceremonial halls, but decorated with the same careful attention, its doorways carved with images of the king, attended by servants carrying fly whisks and parasols, small human details of ordinary royal comfort amid all the grandeur. A king who still needed shade from the sun, and someone to keep the insects away, just like anyone else. After his failed Greek campaign, Xerxes appears, from what evidence survives, to have turned his attention inward for the remaining years of his reign, focusing on building projects, on the administration of an empire that, whatever its setback in Greece, remained overwhelmingly vast, wealthy, and stable, and on the complicated politics of his own royal household, until his assassination in 465 before our era brought his reign, and this particular chapter of the story, to its sudden and violent close. It is worth remembering gently, as we let this part of the story settle, that the man remembered by so much of later Western tradition almost entirely as a defeated invader spent, in truth, the greater part of his more than 20-year reign, not fighting Greeks at all, but quietly governing, quietly building, quietly continuing the long, patient work of empire that had occupied his father and grandfather before him. Let this be one of the last thoughts we leave with tonight. History remembers loudly what was dramatic, and remembers only faintly, if at all, what was simply steady and ordinary and good, and so an entire long reign of careful governance can be reduced, in the retelling across centuries, to a single failed campaign. While decades of quiet, competent administration, the roads maintained, the canals kept flowing, the temples supported, the ordinary daily peace preserved for millions of ordinary people, fade quietly into the background, unremembered, though it was this quiet, steady work, far more than any single battle, that truly defined what the Persian Empire was, for the great majority of the people who lived their entire lives within it. Let us pause too, for a few final quiet minutes, on the Greek cities of Ionia themselves, that string of prosperous settlements along the Anatolian coast, whose long and complicated relationship with Persia we have touched upon several times already tonight, because it was here, in this in-between world, neither fully Greek nor fully Persian, but shaped deeply by both, that one of the most important sources for everything we have discussed tonight was born Herodotus, the historian whose careful, curious, endlessly digressive writing has supplied so much of what we know or think we know about the Persian Empire, was himself born in Halicarnassus, a Greek city on the Anatolian coast that spent much of its history under Persian rule, a city whose own ruling family, remarkably, served loyally as Persian vassals its queen Artemisia, commanding ships in Xerxes' own fleet at the Battle of Salamis and earning, according to Herodotus' own admiring account, Xerxes' personal praise for her courage and tactical skill in the chaos of that battle, even as the broader Persian fleet around her collapsed into disorder and defeat. Herodotus, then, was not quite the straightforward outside observer that later readers sometimes imagine him to be, writing of Persia from safely across a clear and simple divide between Greek and barbarian. He was a Greek who grew up within the Persian Empire's own borders, in a city whose own royal family had served Persian kings, and his history, for all its clear sympathy toward Greek freedom and Greek achievement, carries within it, again and again, moments of genuine curiosity, admiration, and even respect for Persian customs, Persian institutions, and individual Persian figures, a complexity that gets smoothed away all too easily whenever this history is retold, in later centuries, as a simple, clean story of noble Greek freedom against Oriental despotism. The Ionian Greek cities themselves, under Persian rule for the better part of 2 centuries in total, developed a genuinely blended culture. Greek temples and Greek language and Greek philosophical inquiry, the very beginnings of what later ages would call natural philosophy, flourishing in cities like Miletus, even as those same cities paid tribute to a Persian king and hosted Persian administrators within their walls. Some of the earliest Greek philosophers, thinkers like Thales and Anaximander, who first began asking, in a systematic way, what the fundamental nature of the physical world truly was, lived and worked in Miletus during the very same decades that the city existed under Persian authority. And it is worth wondering, gently, here in the quiet dark, how much of that intellectual ferment was itself shaped, in ways never fully recorded, by Miletus's position as a genuine crossroads, a place where Greek tradition met Lydian and Persian, and ultimately much older Babylonian and Egyptian learning as well, carried along the same trade routes and the same relative peace that Persian rule, for all its tensions, provided across such a broad stretch of the ancient world. And let us rest, too, for just a little while longer, on what the Persians themselves believed waited beyond this life, because it is a gentle and strangely comforting vision, well suited to the quiet hour in which you are listening now, in Zoroastrian belief. As it developed across the centuries of Persian history, the soul of the departed was thought to linger near the body for 3 days after death, before setting out at dawn on the 4th day toward a narrow crossing called the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, spanning the gap between the world of the living and the world beyond. There, the soul's own thoughts, words, and deeds across its life were said to be weighed, and the bridge itself was said to change according to that judgment, growing wide and easy to cross for a soul whose life had been lived in truth and goodness, opening onto a realm of light and fragrant gardens, not unlike those very Persian gardens we spoke of earlier, or narrowing to the width of a single blade's edge for a soul whose life had been ruled by falsehood and cruelty, the crossing perilous, uncertain, leading downward instead toward darkness. There is something worth carrying gently into your own rest in this old vision, whether or not you hold any particular belief about what may or may not wait beyond this life yourself. It is the idea that an ordinary life, lived quietly, day by day, in small acts of honesty and kindness, in good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, the same simple threefold formula we heard earlier was understood, in this ancient tradition, to matter enormously, to shape something real and lasting, far more than wealth, or conquest, or the size of the empire a person happened to be born within. A shepherd on a cold Median hillside and a king upon a golden throne in Persepolis were both understood, in this belief, to cross that same narrow bridge in the end, judged by precisely the same simple measure. The daily quality of a life honestly lived. Let that thought settle now like a soft weight, easing you further down into rest. Whatever the true nature of any bridge that may or may not wait at the end of all things, the bridge you are crossing tonight is a smaller, gentler, far more immediate one, simply the quiet passage from waking into sleep, a crossing every living person makes without exception, every single night of their lives, a small nightly journey that asks nothing more of you than to let go gently of the day now finished and to trust, as you have trusted every night before this one. That morning will be there waiting for you on the other side. Before we let the story close, let us wander a little longer through the quieter corners of this vanished world, the way you might linger a while longer in a warm room before finally rising to turn out the last lamp. Think for a moment of the Persian court itself in the years of its greatest splendor, under Darius and then under Xerxes and the kings who followed them. The King of Kings, as the Persian rulers styled themselves, lived a life almost entirely wrapped in ceremony. He was rarely seen eating in public. His meals, prepared by hundreds of palace cooks, drawing on ingredients gathered from every province of the empire, wheat from Babylon, salt from the deserts of the east, wine from the hills of Syria, dates from the palm groves along the Persian Gulf, were said to be so abundant that a portion was always set aside afterward to feed thousands of soldiers and courtiers and servants who lived within the vast orbit of the royal household. To dine at the king's table, even at a distance, even on the leftovers of his own meal, was considered a mark of honor. Around the king moved a great number of officials whose titles have come down to us only in fragments, translated imperfectly across languages and centuries. There were the king's eyes and the king's ears, trusted inspectors sent without warning to provinces across the empire, to watch the satraps, to listen at markets and in courtyards, to make certain that the men entrusted with distant power had not begun to imagine that power as entirely their own. There was the Chiliarch, a kind of chief minister and commander of the royal bodyguard, a position of such closeness to the throne that the men who held it sometimes found themselves dangerously closer to real power than the king himself might have wished. And within the palace walls lived the royal women, whose lives are far harder for us to reconstruct than the lives of kings and generals, because so much of what was written about them was written by outsiders, by Greek visitors, and later Greek historians, who often knew little and imagined much. We know that Persian queens and royal mothers could hold genuine influence, sometimes considerable influence, over matters of succession and court politics. Atossa, daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, is remembered as a formidable presence at court, a woman whose favor helped determine which of Darius's many sons would eventually inherit the throne. Later Greek writers, always eager for a dramatic story, sometimes painted the Persian royal women as scheming and dangerous, figures of harem intrigue and poison, and while we should be cautious of taking such stories at face value, coloured as they often were by Greek prejudice against what they saw as decadent Eastern luxury, it does seem true that the royal household was, in its own quiet way, a centre of real political weight, where marriages were arranged for alliance, where the favour of a mother or a wife could lift one prince above his brothers, where the private rooms of the palace held as much consequence, in their own manner, as the public audience hall where ambassadors came to bow before the throne. Let your thoughts rest now on the provinces themselves, far from the palace, where the true daily texture of the empire was woven. In Egypt, life along the Nile continued much as it always had, the annual flooding of the great river still governing the rhythm of planting and harvest, the old temples still tended by Egyptian priests, though now a Persian satrap sat where a pharaoh once sat, collecting tribute that would travel, eventually, along caravan routes and river barges toward the Persian heartland. In Babylon, the ancient astronomers continued their careful, patient observation of the night sky, recording the movements of the planets on clay tablets with a precision that would, centuries later, feed directly into Greek and then into modern astronomy, a quiet gift passed down almost invisibly through the long chain of history. In the Indus Valley, at the empire's easternmost edge, Persian administrators oversaw a province so distant, so different in climate and custom from the Persian heartland, that it might as well have belonged to another world entirely, and yet its tribute of gold dust, carried across mountains and deserts, still made its way each year to swell the royal treasury. Consider, too, the sheer diversity of tongues that could be heard in a single Persian marketplace, in a single caravan resting for the night along the royal road. Aramaic, which had become something like a common administrative language across much of the Western Empire, evolved precisely because it belonged to no single dominant people, and so offended no one. Old Persian itself, spoken by the ruling elite and carved into royal inscriptions. Elamite, an older language of the Iranian plateau, still used in certain administrative records at Persepolis. Egyptian, Babylonian, Lydian, Phoenician Greek, and further east, tongues that we can barely reconstruct at all today, all mingling in the dust and noise of trade, all of it moving, slowly, patiently, along roads that Darius had built to bind together a world that might otherwise have had no reason at all to speak to itself. Let your breath settle again, slow and even, as we turn back once more toward Greece, and linger a little longer on the Great War that so many later ages would remember above almost everything else the Persian Empire ever did. We spoke already of Thermopylae, of the 3 days when a small Greek force held the narrow pass against the advancing might of Xerxes' army. But it is worth resting a while longer on the days that followed, because the story did not end there, whatever the old poems and the old films might suggest. While Leonidas and his men bought time on land, the Greek and Persian fleets clashed nearby in the narrow straits off the island of Euboea, in a series of running engagements that left both sides bruised and battered, neither able to claim a decisive victory. It was only after Thermopylae fell that the true crisis for Greece began, for with the pass lost, there was nothing left to stop Xerxes' army from marching south into the heart of Greece itself. Athens, upon hearing that the pass had fallen, made one of the most remarkable decisions in the history of the ancient world. Rather than attempt to defend their city, the Athenians evacuated it entirely. Women and children, and the elderly, sent across the water to safety, while the men of fighting age boarded the fleet, trusting their fate to the sea rather than the land. Xerxes' army marched into an empty Athens and burned it, burned the temples on the Acropolis, burned the wooden images of the gods that the Athenians had left behind, a moment of real devastation for the Athenian people, whatever the eventual outcome of the war. But the Athenian fleet, along with ships from Corinth, from Aegina, from a dozen other Greek cities that had set aside their usual rivalries in the face of a common threat, waited in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, and there, in the autumn of 480 before our era, one of the most consequential naval battles in ancient history was fought. The Persian fleet, larger but less maneuverable in the cramped waters of the strait, was drawn into a trap, unable to bring its numerical advantage to bear in such a confined space. Greek ships, lighter and more nimbly handled, rammed and sank Persian vessel after Persian vessel, until the strait itself, by the account of those who wrote of it afterward, grew choked with wreckage and the bodies of drowned men. Xerxes himself, we are told, watched the battle from a golden throne set on a hillside overlooking the strait, expecting to watch his fleet crush the last Greek resistance, and watched instead as that fleet was broken apart before his eyes. It was a blow from which the Persian invasion never fully recovered. Xerxes returned to Asia soon after, leaving a portion of his army under a general named Mardonius to continue the campaign the following year, but at the Battle of Plataea in 479 before our era, that remaining force was decisively defeated by a combined Greek army, and on almost the very same day, according to later tradition, a Greek fleet destroyed the remnants of Persian naval power at a place called Mycale on the coast of Ionia. The great invasion, which had seemed, in its opening months, poised to swallow the whole of Greece, ended within 2 years in total failure. Rest a while here in the quiet dark, and consider how differently this story might have unfolded. Had Xerxes triumphed at Salamis, had Greece been fully absorbed into the Persian Empire, as Ionia had been absorbed a century before, the whole shape of what later ages would call Western civilization might have taken an entirely different form. The philosophy of Athens, the drama, the early experiments in democratic government, all of it might have continued in some form under Persian rule, or might have been extinguished entirely, or might have blended, in ways we cannot now imagine, into something new. History turns again and again on such narrow moments, such single afternoons in such narrow straits of water, and it is worth remembering, as you drift here in the dark, how much of what came after depended on so little. Let your mind wander now toward the long, slow decline that followed these great wars, a decline that took not years but centuries, so gradual that those living through it could hardly have named the moment when the empire's strength began quietly to ebb. The wars with Greece continued in smaller, more scattered form for decades after Xerxes' failed invasion, fought now mostly at sea and along the Ionian coast, until a peace was finally arranged, sometime around 49 before our era. That left the Greek cities of Ionia largely free of Persian control, even as the Persian court continued to play a long and patient game of diplomacy, funding first one Greek city against another, then reversing course entirely, using Persian gold to keep the Greek world divided against itself throughout the long and bitter conflict, later remembered as the Peloponnesian War, when Athens and Sparta tore at each other for nearly 3 decades, weakening both so thoroughly that neither would ever again reach the heights of power they had known before that war began. It is a strange, quiet irony of history that Persia, having failed to conquer Greece by the sword, achieved almost as much through patient gold and careful diplomacy. Watching from a distance as the Greek cities exhausted themselves fighting one another. Within the Persian court itself, the later decades of the empire were marked by increasing turbulence. Sons plotted against fathers. Brothers plotted against brothers. Eunuchs and courtiers, holding positions of trusted proximity to the throne, sometimes wielded influence disproportionate to their formal rank, arranging assassinations, backing one claimant over another, shaping the succession through quiet corridors of poison and whispered counsel rather than open battle. Egypt, always a restless province, rebelled repeatedly against Persian rule, breaking away entirely for long stretches before being reconquered. The vast machinery Darius had built, the satrapies, the roads, the tax system, continued to function, but the hand guiding it grew less certain, the center less commanding, even as the empire's wealth and its outward appearance of grandeur remained, for a long while yet, largely undiminished. And so we return gently to where this long story must end, with a young Macedonian king crossing into Asia, and a Persian empire that still looked, from the outside, as magnificent and unshakable as it had in the days of Cyrus and Darius, but which had grown, in ways not visible from a distance, brittle within. Let yourself sink now, fully into rest. The armies of Persia have long since returned to dust. The great gates of Persepolis stand silent under the stars, visited now only by tourists and the wind. Cyrus sleeps in his plain stone tomb at Pasargadae, and Xerxes and Darius sleep wherever their bones came finally to rest, and none of them can trouble you now, none of the wars, none of the burning cities, none of the ambitions that once seemed as urgent as anything in the world. There is only this. Your breath slow and even, the soft weight of the blankets around you, the quiet dark behind your closed eyes, patient and endless as the Persian night sky once was, spread out over Susa and Persepolis and Pasargadae, the same stars, the very same stars, that once looked down on shepherds tending their flocks in the hills of Anshan, before any of this had happened, before any empire had yet been imagined. Feel your body growing heavier now, sinking down into whatever is supporting you, the mattress, the cushions, the soft folds of the blanket, as if the whole long weight of this story, all its centuries, all its kings and roads and rivers, has settled quietly around you, like sand settling at the bottom of still water. There is nowhere further you need to travel tonight, no road left to walk, no river left to cross, only this stillness, this soft dark, this slow breath moving in and out, and in again at its own unhurried pace. Picture, if you like, one last quiet image before you let even that go. A small clay lamp, burning low in some small room in ancient Susa, its flame no larger than the flame of a single candle, throwing soft shifting light across a plain mud brick wall. Somewhere beyond that wall the empire turns on, kings rise and fall, armies march along roads that stretch farther than any single person could ever walk in one lifetime. But here, in this one small room, someone very much like you is only doing what you are doing now, lying still, letting their breath slow, letting the small worries of an ordinary day settle and dissolve into the deeper quiet of night, letting their eyes close. That person is gone now, of course. has been gone for 25 centuries, their name never recorded anywhere. Their single ordinary night of rest no different in its essence from any other night of rest taken by any other tired person in any other century, including this one, including tonight, and yet in a way, lying here now, breathing slowly, letting go of the day behind you, you are doing the very same thing they once did, the very same rest, the very same release. Some things, it turns out, never really change at all, no matter how many empires rise between then and now. Let your thoughts grow softer. Let them lose their sharp edges, the way a stone in a river loses its edges, slowly, gently, over a very long and patient time, until it is nothing but smooth roundness, easy to hold, easy to let go of. You do not need to remember the names of kings tonight. You do not need to remember the order of battles, or the years of a reign, or the route of a road that no longer exists in the form it once did. Let all of that drift quietly away, like the last low light of a fire settling into embers, into ash, into a warmth that lingers even after the flame itself is gone. There is only this, now. The dark, soft and close around you. Your breath, slower now than when we began. The distant, gentle sense of an old story, finally finished, finally allowed to rest, the way every long day must eventually be allowed to rest. The way every long empire, in the end, is allowed to rest. The way you, too, right now, are allowed, fully and completely, to rest. Let the weight of your eyelids stay closed. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands, wherever they are resting, grow loose and heavy and still. There is nothing to hold on to anymore. Not the story, not the names, not even these words themselves, which can fade now too, growing quieter and quieter. The way a voice grows quieter as someone walks slowly away down a long, dim hallway, further and further until it can barely be heard at all, until it is only a soft murmur, a warm hum, a gentle nothing. Filling the space where sleep is waiting for you, sieve now, let it come, slowly, gently, completely sea leave.